You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. At the start of every week, I sit down with another journalist to talk about the biggest news developing right now and how it affects the Pacific Northwest. And the Mariners must be winning because this guy's got a spring in his step today. It's David Croman from the Seattle Times. Hey, man, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on again.
Yeah, Cole Young is my guy.
Yeah, I know. They look competent suddenly. I appreciate that.
I'm loving that for us. Nails is also my guy. I have so many guys. I know. That's the thing. But
qualities of a good team.
Feels good to have a sweep under our belts for a road series, certainly. Turning now to our top story on Front Page. That's my new turn page sound effect.
The system worked. We were safe. President Trump was safe. His Secret Service agents kept him safe. All of us were safe. And so while, yes, it was a very tragic situation, as President Trump said last night, we are not going to stop living. We're not going to stop being out there with the American people. And that's if that was his goal, he failed.
That's Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche on Meet the Press yesterday. Just a few minutes ago, Cole Thomas Allen was formally charged with attempted assassination in the attack on the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Prosecutors say he brought a shotgun, a handgun, and 3 knives to the event, intending to carry out political assassination. He also faces weapons charges. And, David, this appears to be another attempt on the president's life. Allen was reportedly somebody with a lot of gripes against the president. He left what has been reported as a manifesto expressing grievances against President Trump and had targets other than Trump at the event as well, administration officials. We're not going to spend a whole ton of time on this. New information is coming in all the time. There's a lot of, national media, and including NPR, that's covering this round the clock. But just your initial reaction to what happened on Saturday and its aftermath so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's a harrowing situation. I think the aftermath is a little disheartening because, we've been through this a few times, and it seems like each time there's kind of more misinformation and kind of conspiracy theories about what happened, and also, a race to, assign the alleged shooter to a team, whoever it might be. And, I think it's a sort of difficult situation to have kind of sober conversation about, and that I find unfortunate.
Yeah. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt says that this violence has been caused by a left-wing cult of hatred against the president and all of those who support him and work for him. I mean, depending on how you count, this is either the 3rd or possibly the 5th assassination attempt against Trump since he launched his 2024 presidential campaign. There was, obviously Pennsylvania, Butler, Pennsylvania, and the golf course. But then there was the murder for hire plot that involved Iran's IRGC. And then just in February, this really seemed to go under the radar relatively. The Secret Service killed this 21-year-old who had brought a shotgun and a gas canister to Mar-a-Lago when the president and the first lady were not at their Florida estate. But increasing number of people taking violence as their option for various, we don't know the motivations for everybody here, but for various different reasons, deciding the violence was what they were going to do. And an increasing number of people getting access to the president, closer than comfort, closer than you want to see. Although, again, Todd Blanche saying security worked in this instance.
Yeah, and I think this wasn't quite as close of a call as the attempts during the campaign or even necessarily at his golf course. But, again, I mean, anytime there's that, I know their perimeter held. The shooter didn't get physically that close to the president, but it was in the same hotel. And there have been some questions raised around this broader security at that hotel. But, to the acting attorney general's point, the perimeter held, the Secret Service stopped him, and it seems to have worked out okay, at least for now. Although, of course, as you were saying, larger questions around what is motivating this level of violence and where it's coming from.
Yeah, because we haven't seen it like this before, at least in this frequency. Turning to our next story on Front Page.
I think the county is responsible, the city's responsible, the board is responsible as overseers. And so I don't think that anybody can wash their hands of this situation. What matters now is that we fix these problems and make sure that we protect taxpayer dollars and protect our most vulnerable communities that are out in the street.
That's the voice of King County Executive Gurmai Zahalai. He is talking about the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. A forensic audit of KCRHA's financials released last week showed the agency had misplaced at least $8 million in public funds. Several elected officials have called for the agency to be dissolved, David. I mean, concerns over KCRHA have been ongoing. This isn't new, but the specifics of what looks like pretty serious financial mismanagement, this is new. Can you kind of share some lowlights for people, what they should keep in mind about what was found in this audit?
Yeah, and to your point, there's sort of two levels of conversation to be had about KCRHA. There's the broader level of, is it doing what people wanted it to do when it was created? This, though, is a little more specific. And actually, there have been some audits in the past that have raised some issues. And I think part of the reason that this one has landed so hard is it suggests that those past kind of, I would call them yellow flags, were not heeded to and not taken seriously enough, because this one has kind of graduated those yellow flags into full-on red flags.
This one is a crimson.
Yeah, exactly.
Deep maroon, maybe.
Exactly. And, I think there's a lot of headlines about the missing dollars, and that is legitimate and real. I think the probably more troubling piece of it, though, goes a little deeper than it's kind of more what those dollars represent rather than the actual dollars themselves. And KCRHA is built on this model that requires pretty intense financial let's say care, which is that they put money out into the world to homeless service providers, nonprofits, to do their work, and then they go back to Seattle and King County and are reimbursed for the dollars they've put out there. That isn't a totally rare model, but it does put them in a situation where you have to be super, super careful about keeping track of where those dollars have gone. Are they doing what they're supposed to do? And then when you turn around and ask for the reimbursement, you have to have all your ducks in a row so you can be sure that the correct dollars are going to the correct places. This audit has essentially concluded that no, none of that was happening. It's not an unworkable financial model, it was saying, but the way that KCRHA, the Homelessness Authority, is doing it basically means those dollars are sort of flying in all different directions without really proper documentation of to where. It appears that a lot of different people that maybe shouldn't have access to those dollars do. The reimbursement to recoup those dollars is taking so long that they have accrued close to $1.5 million in just interest that
is wild.
That will never be recovered, because there was one instance where it took them 16 months to get reimbursed for money that they put out into the community, and so that debt is accruing interest, and we don't get reimbursed for interest. So for every dollar of interest that they're spending, that's taxpayer dollars that is not going to homeless services.
Just completely wasted.
Totally
just
wasted. Yeah,
interest.
Totally wasted.
Yeah.
And again, it's not exactly an indictment of the very model, but it's just saying, if you do things this way, you just have to be really, really careful and really forensic about how you're keeping track of those dollars. And the top line conclusion is just that is not happening here at all.
So when we say $8 million misplaced, the actual amount of potential issues could be much more,
yes.
right? I mean, we're talking
exactly.
about more than $500 million, $533 million, over this period of 4 years or so. And the $8 million that's misplaced is one thing. But if you can't tell, that there were specific invoices showing what the money went for and where it went, this could be a much bigger deal.
Yes. Yeah, there was this sort of classic defense mechanism from the CEO. She sent out this email to all staff and saying, well, good news, the audit found that there was no outright fraud. And that's true, but the audit saying part of the reason we couldn't guarantee that there wasn't any fraud is because there's just such bad documentation. There could very well be fraud here,
Oh, no.
but we can't prove that there isn't.
There could be, but there's so little documentation that it's impossible to even draw the outlines of what could be there. Yeah.
So there's no clear evidence of fraud happening here. But again, this is, Seattle sends $120 million a year to KCRHA. As you said, more than $500 million have passed through this agency since it launched in earnest in 2021. And so when you have that amount of money flowing through, I mean, because it's really a pass-through organization. It's local governments giving this organization money and then that organization distributing it. And so when you have that amount of just pure taxpayer funds flowing through it, and then you have this audit saying, well, we can't guarantee that all this money went to where it was supposed to, it really opens the door to, because, a lot of people have been skeptical about the KCRHA generally, and this just throws gasoline on a fire that had been, I would say, simmering for a while about questioning whether this is the best way to tackle homelessness. Now you've got this audit saying, they're being pretty sloppy here, and so it just makes it really easy for people to say, what, let's just cut bait here.
I mean, there's so many directions to go with this. First of all, I just want to note, King County in its oversight of funds is facing another huge controversy about how it's conducting the financials of its human services grants and where that money is going and how much potentially, I mean, your outlet, the Seattle Times, reporting on, $800,000 being funneled to somebody's family members. That is an ongoing question about the future of how King County oversees those funds. So that's one thing. Another thing is, as you say, a lot of people have been skeptical of KCRHA for years now. Seattle has been moving away from relying on KCRHA already. I mean, Bruce Harrell did that, and it seems like Katie Wilson, the current mayor, is accelerating that. I mean, all of these promises she has for shelter beds and how fast she's going to stand up that shelter, it's not going through KCRHA. It's all city focused. So, I mean, I guess my question is, who's calling for it to be disbanded and who's defending it at this point?
Yeah, a few people are calling for it to be disbanded. Councilmember Reagan Dunn has been calling for it to be disbanded for about 3 years now, so he was kind of the first. But this audit has opened up, Seattle Councilmember Maritza Rivera and King County Councilperson Rod Dembowski have both called for it to be disbanded. Mayor Wilson said all options are on the table, which certainly does not rule out that she would be willing to pull the plug. Seattle Councilmember Eddie Lynn said, stop short of calling for it to be folded, but basically said, Seattle is gonna do its own thing here, regardless of whether or not it exists.
Which indicates that this is across the spectrum. Because when you're saying Reagan Dunn, it's like, well, sure, he's kind of the conservative on the King County Council, or one of the very few. But then you're seeing Eddie Lynn, who's a new progressive on the city council. Like, this is people across the political divide are looking at this and saying, we got to change something.
Yeah, exactly. I would say that we're not hearing a lot of full-throated defense of the organization itself, but the pushback has been, okay, so you want to fold this agency. Again, we're talking about hundreds of millions. It's a $200 million a year organization. A lot of the staff that ran homelessness service responses before it was created in Seattle and King County don't work in local government anymore. A lot of them were fired, laid off. They have probably gone elsewhere and gotten new jobs. All of the contracts that these different governments held have been transferred to King County Regional Homelessness Authority. It would take at least a year to unwind this. And so the defense we've seen is, how confident are we that by folding KCRHA, we are going to end up with a product that better serves people living outside? And I asked Councilmember Dembowski that, and he said, we're not, basically. He said, all I can tell you is that I think the Regional Homelessness Authority has failed, but that's not a huge endorsement or a huge voice of confidence for what could follow that. And so I think if you're going to make a defense here, it's, rather than folding this to try and set up some uncertain third thing, let's invest the time and energy into fixing the Regional Homelessness Authority. I would say that Executive Gurmai Zahalai he hasn't said definitively one way or the other, but seems probably a little more supportive of keeping it than perhaps Mayor Wilson is right now. So I would have told you on Friday that its days are numbered. I'm maybe backing off that a little bit now. I'm not sure which direction it could go. I think it's still precarious, but there is a legitimate argument that unwinding it is more work than it would be worth rather than just trying to fix it.
I guess my question is just optically and from the political perspective, how can anybody in elected government right now, come to the voters or come to the taxpayers and say we need to spend more on homelessness response when you look at something like this. Like, it's just not going to be a credible ask until the House is cleaned up. And I don't know how they can kind of win back public sentiment, by keeping the organization as it is. But as you say, you don't want to create like more inefficiencies and more waste because you're throwing something out too quickly or, what have you. Is the KCRHA, this is a very blunt question, good for anything? Like, one of the things that these joint organizations do for elected officials, and I saw this in Southern California when I was reporting in Los Angeles, is it creates this nice separate agency that's not the county, not the city, that people can point fingers at and say the dysfunction is over there.
Yes, exactly.
The problems all exist in that agency. It's not us, know?
Yeah, this creation really took a lot of heat off of Seattle City Hall.
Yeah. And so is that almost like helping to keep it running, or has that run out now?
Well, I think that's probably run out because the people who created it aren't in office anymore. And I think what we're seeing to an extent is a race by, no one wants to be the last, no one wants to lose this game of musical chairs. No one wants to be holding the bag on what ends up, if we get there, being a failed governmental organization. And so I do think we're seeing a bit of a race to get ahead of that and get ahead of the criticism. I do think that the King County issues with its contract inform probably a lot of the response here, because it's a bad look that King County has been doing a not very good job keeping track of its human services dollars. I think local lawmakers recognize how bad that has looked. And so when this audit comes out, they're like, I want to be ahead of this.
Yeah.
We want to look like we're being really decisive here and we're taking strong action, because, you could get into the nuts and bolts of the audits. But to your point before, a government agency has to retain legitimacy to be effective. And so even if you can kind of quibble with exactly what the audit is concluding, if people lose faith in its ability to deliver, that's kind of it, because it is up to voters to decide which direction the local government should go. And, I think that is why we're seeing kind of such a floodgate of intense response to this audit.
Yeah. And I think Erica C. Barnett and others have raised the issue of, now, what about federal contracts? And do they look at this and say you're not complying with the necessary, basics of receiving federal dollars? And so that could have ripple effects here. Leaving this just for now, it's obviously an ongoing story, and people absolutely can follow David Croman's reporting in the Seattle Times on this, and the reporting that you guys are doing in the county too is really great. Turning to our third story on front page. So the city of Seattle is pushing back against claims that its new app delivery driver pay law did not increase driver pay. This is a law passed by the city council that went into effect January 2024. It's called the App-Based Worker Minimum Pay Ordinance. And basically, it's more complicated than this, but it set up a standard pay for $5 per delivery. There's something to do with minutes and miles, but ultimately, you get the base pay of $5, instituted for the drivers. Companies like Uber Eats, DoorDash, and Grubhub have said that this regulation led to higher prices for consumers, fewer orders, and lower tips, which decreased driver pay. There was some other research that showed driver pay stayed flat, didn't change. But now Seattle's Office of Labor Standards released a report that says they are wrong, that the law actually has worked as intended and increased pay for drivers. What are they saying, David, and how did you take this new data from the city?
They are saying, I think they're saying that since this law went into effect in early 2024, the results for drivers have improved since then. And I think their data does back that up. It doesn't exactly answer the question of whether that is better than the status quo that existed before this legislation existed.
Or would have existed if the legislation didn't get passed. Yeah.
And the reason for that is that the city just doesn't have access to the data. So I would say the thing that gives the city's report here the most legitimacy is they do have the most access to data that we've ever seen, because, these gig work companies, Uber, DoorDash, it transcends just delivery, Lyft, whatever you want to, they're all very fiercely protective of their internal data. They see it as intellectual property, and they're very hesitant to release that. And I think that has always, because they have always made the argument that this law actually hurts drivers, it has been always a little difficult to take them at face value because they just don't release the data to back that up. They put out their own reports and articles and things like that, but it's been difficult to kind of drill into exactly what they're saying. At the same time, the previous reports that have concluded that this law hurts drivers have taken into account kind of what the reality was before it went into effect. And they found that for whatever baseline wage increases the drivers have found, that has been canceled out by dips in total number of orders and tips. People aren't tipping as much.
Yeah, although the orders seem to be bouncing back.
They seem to be bouncing back as compared to early 2024 right after this law took effect. Again, that doesn't really look at what it was before the law took effect. It's interesting because it sort of gets at this, like, do the intentions match the results? Because the intention here was, look, the gig economy is pretty unregulated and we can't say for sure that these drivers are being paid the minimum wage that we want them to. So we're going to try and regulate this. That is a little more complicated than just paying a restaurant worker a baseline minimum wage, because you have to account, when they're driving, when they're actually, bringing a meal to you or whatever it might be. But the argument here is that, the kind of more unregulated space may have actually been better. This report from the Office of Labor Standards throws that into doubt a little bit, but it certainly is not a settled question.
We did call up this third party that we mentioned. There was, data from the delivery app companies, which said driver pay went down. The data from the city is saying, no, it went up. Carnegie Mellon's Andrew Guerin is a professor of economics there who researched this. He used data from a third-party app that drivers use to kind of manage their drives across different apps. And he had come on our show a few weeks ago to share his research showing that the driver pay had remained flat. And so we called him up to ask him to react to the city's new data.
Our results don't necessarily disagree with even their claims. Their main claim is that base pay went up per hour after the reform. And that is exactly what we find.
So Guerin found basically that, yes, base pay for gig workers did increase after the new law was put in place. That's as intended, but overall pay stayed the same. Again, as you mentioned, because of a drop-off in tips and also fewer deliveries completed. Guerin said he is glad that the city's digging into data, but he wants, more comparisons here, which is really hard to do. They just don't have that.
It's missing two really important features, which is we don't know what the people in those data would have been earning before. There's no data from before the policy went into effect. And beyond that, there's also no data outside of Seattle.
And he says his team was able to look at the driver pay before and after the law, and he compared it with data from other cities. One last thing from Andrew Guerin here. There was, again, this initial dip in the number of deliveries. But as we mentioned, it seems to be bouncing back, and that is something that they want to look more into. And he thinks overall it's really cool that the Office of Labor Standards is releasing this data, and it's good to have more transparency. And boy, I don't think this debate is going to end anytime soon, David, because we're hearing such different things from the business community and from the city.
No, although it should be noted that the previous council tried to rewrite these rules in early 2024. Former council president Sarah Nelson, and it really didn't. It kind of went down in flames at the end there. So regardless of the conclusion, I just don't think there's any sort of political appetite in City Hall to revisit this policy.
Okay, one more turn of the page for our fourth story on Front Page. Really quickly, I just wanted to shout out Cameron Breeden at University High School in Spokane Valley. Cameron noticed a fellow student who was new to his school, who was struggling to get around. Daniel is blind and nonverbal, and Daniel had a homemade PVC pipe scooter wheel device that was helping him navigate the halls. And these wheels were always getting stuck. It wasn't working for Daniel very well. So Cameron saw Daniel, and Cameron has an uncle who is blind. And when he saw Daniel struggling, he thought, I can do something about that for Daniel. Cameron took materials from his career and technical education class, and he made a new walker with like a square platform with 3 wheels, sort of like those suitcases that can go in all directions. They can pivot and turn with Daniel. It has handles of the right height for his hands. It's in the beta testing phase now, and so far it doesn't tip over. It doesn't get stuck like the old device. And Daniel's comprehensive education teacher, Heidi Downey, said, "Isn't this what you want in the world? Somebody who grows up and sees a neighbor, sees a kid in the community, and instead of only seeing a difference, they ask themselves, How can they help them? And shout out to Emily White at the Spokesman Review, who reported on this. I love this. I mean, my impression is that this class is basically like a shop class. David, I don't know. Did you have shop class when you were in school?
I did, yeah.
I never took it, and I wish I had, because this is sort of like,
I only
to
made
me,
like a doorknob, though. I never made anything quite so touching and helpful.
You never made an assisted device for a classmate? No. I mean, for me, this is like a win for shop class and a win for just being a good member of the community. And especially after a day like today, I needed a little uplift.
Yeah, it's an antidote to cynicism.
Yes. So shout out to the Spokesman Review. Shout out to Cameron Breeden at University High School in Spokane Valley. And shout out to David Croman for coming on and once again knocking Front Page out of the park. Really appreciate you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime right here online at KUOW.org, or of course on your favorite podcast app.